Hey everybody, it's Tyler Austin. Thank you so much for watching. So the great debate, steel versus polymer AK magazines. What are the pros and cons of each? Which one's better and all that? That's what we're going to talk about today. So let's first talk about steel magazines. What are the pros? Well, number one, they're tanky and they can basically survive anything you throw at them. They're just extremely, extremely durable. Really, the only thing that could potentially happen with these is if the body gets dented. That can potentially interfere with the follower traveling up and down the magazine, which obviously can cause problems. But a lot of times, if that does happen, what you can do is like take a screwdriver or something and just push that dent out, and the magazine will work just fine again. But really, other than that, I mean, these things will survive anything you can throw at them. They'll survive a nuclear blast. They're just great. They're super durable, and again, they'll just survive anything you throw at them. Another pro, a bunch of pros here really, is that they're very easy to find, especially on the used market. Generally speaking, all of them are going to work just fine, so there's not like really any really bad steel magazines out there. And they're generally going to be pretty cheap because there's just a lot of them out there. That's like a bunch of pros, but but I'm just going to combine them all into one. So you can basically find these anywhere. Virtually every gun store in the United States will have a bin of these somewhere, and they're going to be relatively inexpensive. You could probably pick these up for like $5 or $10 a pop, especially on the used market. And even if they have some like cosmetic problems, like they have a little bit of rust or whatever, typically they'll clean up just fine, and they'll function just as reliably as if they were new. This one has a little bit pitting on it from when I first bought it because it had a bunch of rust on it. Has some pitting on there. I just cleaned it up and it functions just fine. Gives the magazine a little bit of character. Also, most steel magazines out there, they're going to work just fine. So there's not a whole lot of like poor quality steel magazines that you should just avoid at all costs. Generally speaking, if it's a steel magazine, they're hard to screw up. They're going to work just fine. So those are the pros of the steel magazines. What are the cons? Well, some of the cons, number one, and probably the biggest, is that they're heavy. And they're noticeably, if not significantly, heavier than polymer magazines. I mean, if I take a polymer magazine, a steel magazine, it is noticeably heavier. And you multiply that by 7, 8, 9, 10, depending on how many magazines you're carrying, that adds up, especially for 7.62 magazines, because 7.62 mags are just going to be heavier in general because it's just a bigger, heavier cartridge. The next con is that due to their design, because they have like the spine on the back, and more so because they have like this pretty steep lip at the very top of the magazine, these can make it pretty. These can be pretty picky on what magazine carriers or magazine pouches they like to go into. Especially the magazine pouches that use like little plastic inserts, like the Haley strategic inserts for their micro rigs or whatever. This steel lip at the very top of the magazine will have a tendency to want to catch on those, and it can make it can get the magazine kind of stuck in the pouch. So that can be kind of annoying. So these can be kind of picky on what magazine pouches they like. Another con is that because they're steel, they can rust. So they might require a little bit more maintenance than like a polymer magazine, especially if you're using them a lot in like the rain and whatnot. They can rust up, and it's just something you're going to have to watch out for, and something you may have to basically you just might have to maintain these a little bit more than you would with a polymer magazine because they're steel and because they can rust. So those are the pros and cons of steel magazines. All right, so now let's talk about polymer magazines. These come in many different flavors, from these Bulgarian commercial magazines with the steel reinforced feed lips and locking tabs. These are personally my favorite magazines out on the market, to Magpul P mags, which have been a standard for reliability for a long time. There's a bunch of other magazines out on the market too, and obviously the military surplus magazines from the Russian Bakalites, to Bulgarian like Circle 10 waffle magazines as well. These come in a lot of different flavors. Now, what are the pros of polymer magazines? Well, number one, they're lightweight. a lot lighter than the steel magazines, which again is a very big plus, especially when you're carrying a lot of magazines, because that extra weight definitely adds up. So they're lightweight. Another pro, they're very, very durable. They might not be as durable as like a full steel magazine, but in terms of like practical use, these are going to be more than durable enough to get the job done. Especially the ones with steel reinforcements in them, and more so the military surplus magazines that have steel reinforcements on not only the feed lips and the locking tabs, but also reinforcements on the sides and on the front and back straps. Those things are tanky. Those things can handle anything that a steel magazine can, and those things are really tough. But these magazines that just have the reinforcements, really the most important parts, which are the feed lips and the locking tabs, these things are pretty much going to handle any practical use that you will put them through. Another pro is that I find that these polymer magazines tend to fit into rifles better. They tend to go in a little bit smoother. They tend to hang up a little less than steel magazines. This is kind of my personal experience, so take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. But in my personal experience, I find that these tend to load into rifles a little bit smoother, and they don't tend to hang up as easily as steel magazines. Again, just my personal experience, so take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. Your mileage may vary, but again, that's just my personal experience. The next pro is that these will be a little less picky when it comes to magazine pouches, because they don't have that spine on them, and they don't typically have much of a lip on the top. So these tend to be a lot less picky on what magazine pouches they like to go into. And also, finally, because they're polymer, you're not going to have to worry about like rust issues or anything like that. So maintenance may be a little bit easier. Now, if they have steel reinforcements, you might have to keep a lookout on those. But other than that, you're not going to have any rust issues with the body. So those are the pros of the polymer magazines. What are some of the cons? Well, number one, they're going to be a little bit more expensive because you're typically going to have to buy them new. You don't really find these a whole lot on the used markets. You can, but generally speaking, you're going to have to buy them new. And they're not terribly expensive, obviously depending on which one you go for. But I mean, these Bulgarian ones, which again, these are my favorite magazines out on the market. These are like $15 on Gun Mag Warehouse. So these aren't bad at all, but they are going to be generally a little bit more expensive than steel magazines, especially if you can find the steel magazines used. Another con is because there's a lot of different polymer magazines out on the market, some of them are not terribly reliable and you should avoid them. Things like Tapco magazines or Pro Mags, those have kind of a reputation for not being terribly reliable, so I would avoid them. So that is another con to these, is that there are magazines out there that aren't terribly reliable and that you should avoid. It's not really the place with steel magazines, simply because most steel magazines out there, they're going to function just fine. And there's not really any bad steel magazines out there on the market that I'm really aware of. Another potential con of polymer magazines, especially polymer magazines that do not have steel reinforced feed lips, is that sometimes they can break, crack, or just like deform, and that can obviously cause problems, will cause problems, and that is definitely not the case with steel magazines. The feed lips on those are not going to like break on you, typically. So that is another potential con of polymer magazines. Typically, it's not the case with the polymer magazines that have steel reinforcements in them, so typically I recommend those. But for complete polymer magazines, that is a potential issue you may run into. So yeah, those are the pros and cons of polymer magazines. Now, which ones do I typically prefer personally? Personally, I'm a polymer magazine guy simply because they're lighter weight, they're durable, and they tend to fit into pouches better. Nothing wrong with steel magazines. These things are fantastic too. So if you have a bunch of these, absolutely nothing wrong with them. Use them. They're great, but personally, if I had my choice, I'm going to go with Polymer magazines. Now, I'll quickly talk about 74 magazines. When it comes to 545 magazines, you're typically not going to have much of a choice. You're going to have to go with Polymer. Now, I do believe that the Poles make steel AK-74 magazines, but they're not going to be terribly common. So with that being said, you're going to have to go with Polymer. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, especially if you get these surplus magazines like the Russian Plums or like the Bulgarian Blacks or the Bakelites. These things are absolutely bomb-proof because they have a lot of steel reinforcement in them, not only in the feed lips, locking tabs, but also the body has steel reinforcements not only on the sides, but both the front and the back straps. These things are absolutely bomb-proof, about as bomb-proof as it gets when it comes to Polymer magazines. Now, the commercial magazines are great too, especially these Bulgarian commercial magazines because they have steel reinforcements everywhere that it counts, really, which is the feed lips and the locking tabs. These things are great too. Are they going to be as durable as these? Probably not, but practically speaking, these things are going to handle any practical use that you're going to put them through. So for 545 magazines, you're really going to be stuck with Polymer. So I hope you found this video helpful and informative. Please like, subscribe, follow, depending on where you're watching this. If you would like to become more proficient in using your AK, be sure to check out my ebook, Combative Kalashnikov. You can find that on my website, gungearstrategic.com. I'll have a link down in the description below, of course. So if that's something that would interest you, be sure to check that out. Again, that's Combative Kalashnikov, Mastering the AK Rifle. It's my ebook. You can find that on my website, gungearstrategic.com. Again, I'm Tyler Austin. Thank you so much for watching.